Hello, this is Scarlett, and I will try to bring you here a summary of a new podcast series. It's been out for, I think a month or two now. It's made by Jeremy Cried and Mariana and it's called Lost in Panama. I have not seen too many videos about it on YouTube yet, and on my blog I have already written down extensive summaries of this podcast and also some commentary. But I understand also that it's quite a time-consuming business to read through it all, and that for a lot of people it's just easier to listen to videos or to watch videos on YouTube. So I will try my best to also put the information in this video. It's just a summary, so if you want to hear all the details, and in general I would advise you to listen to the podcast itself because it's much more detailed, of course. I'm just giving a summary and some commentary here and there. But and I will put the link below this video to the podcast itself. Don't get mad with the messenger. I'm just giving you a summary, and these are the findings of Jeremy Cried and Mariana and their team, of course. But I do like to say that I was really pleasantly surprised by this podcast. I really enjoyed listening to it, and I thought they did a really good job actually. Going to Bukete, walking the Pinista Trail themselves and talking to a lot of people in the area, and also somehow linked to this case. It's good to know probably that, and I think most people who follow this case for some time already, they already know the name Jeremy Cried because he is a journalist for the Daily Beast. And Mariana maybe less well known, at least I didn't know her, but she's an American television host, author, and motivational speaker, Wikipedia says. And she was born in Venezuela, which is quite interesting because she obviously speaks Spanish and knows the culture maybe a little bit, being, I don't know, I think it's Latin America still, Venezuela, maybe it's Southern America, but it's near Panama, roughly speaking. So I think they really had a benefit there because Mariana could speak with locals and also felt probably a little bit more at home in the culture. I don't know, more than I would have, at least if I'd gone there, which I have not. So Jeremy Cried, he wrote a series of articles actually about the disappearance of Kris and Lisanne, already back in 2016 and 2017. I really enjoyed that series. Thought it was really interesting because he went to Boquete back then as well. And initially he seemed to believe that these girls had an accident. And he also wrote about that. But over time, I think he just spoke to more and more locals and professionals. And you could sense in these articles quite clearly that Cried would slowly start to suspect that there was actually foul play involved. And he came with arguments, of course, for that. Not everyone agrees with that analysis, but his articles were really among the very first investigational pieces on this case. And I think the articles contain really a ton of wealth. I refer to them a lot in my own blog series about this case. So, just one more thing about these articles. I think they received a lot of praise, but also a little bit of criticism here and there. For instance, about his written claims that night photo 580 showed blood, which is the night photo where you see the back of what seems to be Chris's head, the same strawberry blonde hair. And at the time, Jeremy Cried was one of the very few people who had access to copies of these night photo originals. And it was only after all those photos were leaked, or almost all the photos were leaked and published by Juan actually, that we could see for ourselves what the full photo 580 looks like, and that there is no clear blood visible. At the time, we had to believe him, so this caused a little bit of, uncertainty really, and a lot of debate. But other than that, I thought these investigational pieces were really fantastic. So the interesting thing is that now, on April 1st of 2022, so less than a year ago, Jeremy Krise went back to Boquete, and he brought Mariana with him, and their team, of course. And he actually went back to the Pianista Trail, but he also went back to some people he interviewed, I think about, 7 years ago. And they came to some really interesting discoveries. Not everyone seems to believe that what they found out is true. And one of the arguments I read about afterwards is that it's all hearsay and there's no hard evidence. But I think you should just listen to what they have discovered and judge for yourself. So I will start with episode 1 of this podcast series, which in total consists of 7 episodes. And there are also after shows, which are used by Krise and Atencio to dive a little bit deeper in some of the topics they discussed in the main show. And I think they also injected a few extra details there, because the podcast itself is freely available, but for the after shows, you need to pay basically. But I had access to them all, so if there's anything case-shattering mentioned in the after shows, I will also tell you about it. But obviously I'm not gonna quote them entirely, because I think you should really check them out for yourselves. So anyway, as I said, I give a summary here. And in episode 1, we hear the voices of the podcast makers themselves. Krise and Atencio, they talk. Mariana a little bit more than Jeremy. So we learn that it's April 1st of 2022 that they go back to Boquete. I thought it was great that they went actually on the anniversary of the disappearance. Not just because of emotional value, but also because it's just interesting to have experience from someone on the trail around the same time of year when Kris and Lisanne went there. Of course, they didn't have the exact same weather circumstances. From what I understood, it was a little bit more muddy, a bit more wet on the trail when the podcast makers went there. But at least it was the same time of year, so there are some similarities there. So they give quite a detailed description of the Pianista hike, and because I went up there at the exact same time of year, like I said, we have a little bit extra dimension. When they reach top, the Mirador, we hear from Krise and Atencio, as I will refer to them now, that it is still not obvious at that point, so 8 years later, that you reach the end of the trail and that you have to turn around to go back down to Boquete. So 8 years later, there's still not really a super clear sign that says make a turnaround here. They also mention that once they continue down the other side of the Mirador, they lose cell reception within minutes. And 20 minutes into that descent, they try to call 911, but they cannot make a connection. Their phones cannot make a connection. So this is similar to what Hans Kremers noted already in his Answers for Kris video, which I've translated for you and it's on my channel. I'll put a link down below. Once they go down the other side, so away from the Mirador, the same way we know Kris and Lisanne went because of the photos we found on their camera, they describe that the gully has rock walls, and the podcast makers confirm that you really only can go forward or backwards here, and that there's no way out when you are in danger. I mean, you cannot climb the steep walls very easily, and there are no real exits, which is also something we already knew, but it's good to see that confirmed. Like the guys from Imperfect Plan, who make really great articles about this case also, and who also already described running into other people, even on this part of the trail. The same happens to Krise and Atencio. They also pass a local man on the trail here, even though this is supposedly like no man's land and the Wild West, but there are people there, locals. They go there, they walk there, and this local who They meet on that part of the trail. He tells them that they shouldn't walk that trail at night as it's too dangerous then. And he tells them that there are sheds in the area where you can take shelter. He advises them actually to take shelter. And this made me wonder why Kris and Lisanne may never have found such a shelter if it is truly so that they called the Dutch emergency number at 16:39 p.m. because they were anxious that they couldn't make it back in Buket before sundown, which is one theory why they called emergency services. Another theory is, of course, that people believe they may have felt threatened by something, or there was an accident, there was an injury. But if it is really so that they called 112 twice before 5 p.m. that day, the first day, that they did so because they thought they were lost, but they couldn't be lost really, but they were stuck behind the Mirador and wouldn't make it back in time to Boquete, then at least there were sheds in the area, although they may not have known where they were located. In this episode 1, there is also an interview. Kris and Lisanne, they interview Martina, who we know already because she is one of the witnesses, also featuring in other interviews and in one of the videos that I've put on my channel about the witnesses. She lives along the Pianista Trail, on the Boquete side of the trail. She is a Ngobe Bugle native. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And I think Jeremy Cried already talked to her in the past. But in any case, they talk to her now again. And she tells them that she did see Kris and Lisanne going up the trail that day in 2014, April 1st. And that she never thought they would disappear after that. And when asked what she believes has happened to them, Martina answers, there was definitely someone who killed them. Of course, she says this now 8 years later, when she had a lot of time probably to think about things and maybe was a bit influenced by the media. But nevertheless, this is what she says. She also doesn't know who killed them, but is convinced that it wasn't the river that killed Kris and Lisanne. And she says that the government has spread lies when they claim the girls drowned in the river. She also tells the podcast makers that right after the girls went missing, local guide F came to her house and essentially told her to shut up about this case and not to talk to anyone about the fact that she had seen the Dutch girls. So I call him local guide F. I mean, most people will know the full name, but I will stick to that. And girls, I say Dutch girls. In Dutch, we often say meiden, which is like something in between girls and women, for girls in their very early 20s or late teens. It's not to diminish them as little girls. It's just, it's affectionate term for very young women. So that's why I call them girls, but it's, yeah. Anyway, then we go to Martina telling Jeremy Cried and Mariana that she's afraid of this guide F, and that he threatened her with jail time for telling the truth, and that she's visibly shaking, and that she asked the two journalists to protect her. Well, we hear that, and we hear them tell us that, but it is, of course, Martina's subjective feeling and also her own recollection of things. So, yeah, it's good to know this, but I cannot say for sure if it is the 100% truth. Nevertheless, that's part 1, episode 1. Then we go to episode 2. I'll try to keep this short, but it's quite a long episode with a lot of details and information, so bear with me. Episode 2, Cried and Lisanne bring up that they have the official case files in their possession, and that it consists of 5 overstuffed envelopes with nearly 3,000 pages. So that is fantastic. Jeremy says that there is one name that pops up again and again and again, and it's the name of Guide F. He tells a little bit about how we heard about him back in 2016, that Guide F refused to talk with him or come to an interview, that he talked with different people in the area, and some they had praise for the guide, and others they warned him that they wouldn't allow or advise their female tourists, especially to book his services. So yeah, well, that would be considered hearsay then, I guess, but it's an interesting detail nevertheless. Some paint him as a saint. Others believe him as responsible for the deaths of Kris and Lisanne. But he plays a starring role in the initial investigation, police investigation, is what Kris and Lisanne confirm here. We already know, and I already detailed in my blog a lot about all the aspects of the case that he was linked to. And you can say that he did that because he really helped out to try to find them. But opinions vary on that one. So the two journalists, they go on to quote Koude Kaas directly based on this interview with police, which is really interesting and helped me to update my blog actually, with source links, of course. And the podcast makers just highlight a couple of statements, of course. And listen, I have written in great detail and at great lengths in my blog series about this entire timeline from the moment that Koude Kaas first got to know about Kris and Lisanne, to him meeting up with Eileen and going to Miriam's place to look for them, eventually going to police. And it's quite interesting. I think it's a long read, but it's quite interesting because I tend to quote him in all the different interviews he gave, and now I can add his quotes from the actual police interview. And they are not straightforward. He goes back and forth. He contradicts himself on all sorts of details. So this is really not the place, this video, to go into all of that. It would take me hours. So if you're really interested in the bigger context of this entire timeline based on quotes from himself and from others, then I would urge you to go to my blog post series and read about it. Link below. So what I do now is just highlight what is said in this podcast in terms of new information. But it's just a little bit here, a little bit there. There's no big timeline overview. So back to this podcast, Koude Kaas declared to police on April 1st. He got a phone call from the Spanish by the River language school, where he had earlier that day seen Kris and Lisanne, is what he declares. So in other interviews he said he never met them, but here to police he said he did. Earlier that day, so on the day of their disappearance, which is Tuesday, April 1st, one of the employees of Spanish by the River called him to make a last-minute appointment for Kris and Lisanne to go to a local farm, is what Koude Kaas declared. They called me to tell me the two young women I had seen at the school wanted to go to Mr. Philo's farm in Alto Kiel. I didn't have any commitment the next day, so I told her I'd pick them up at 8 o'clock in the morning at the school. That's what we agreed on. And please notice here, this is Scarlett speaking, so this is not in the podcast, but notice that this supposed appointment was made at a time when Kris and Lisanne were already away on their Pinista hike on the Tuesday. And we know from an early interview from this guide with La Prensa, by the way, that it were Marjolein and Eileen who called him. He told La Prensa, Eileen told me to go to Spanish by the River on Wednesday to look for them there. Kris and Lisanne continued to quote Koude Kaas saying, I arrived at the school at 8 in the morning. The German girl I was standing outside the school waiting for me, ready with her little backpack. We talked for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, and she told me, these girls aren't coming, they are usually on time. And as a joke, not thinking they would be missing for long, I told her, they might usually show up on time, but they can't be as punctual as you Germans. She told me, no, they are usually on time. These are new details for me, actually, so that's good. A little bit of humor. As Dutch people, we like jokes about Germans, so I cannot fault him there. But it's interesting that Eileen seems to know what was usual for Kris and Lisanne. That interests me because from all we know, she barely knew them. They were at the same time in Bocas del Toro, the 2 weeks before Kris and Lisanne went to Boquete, but there's really no information that they hang out there together. Eileen is not mentioned in their diaries once in the Bocas times. All we know is that they were together on the shuttle bus ride to Boquete, and that they then met at the language school. So how does Eileen know how punctual they are or not? I don't know. We also learn that Guide F was out of town on Tuesday. We learned that already. This is not in the podcast, but yeah, multiple sources have claimed that on this Tuesday morning or afternoon, Guide F was not in Boquete at all, but he was in David, a little town about 35 kilometers south of Boquete, on a hospital visit. So how early did he drop by Spanish by the River exactly then, if he met Kris and Lisanne that day, considering they went up the Pianista already by 11 in the morning? And how did he see them exactly? So we have no idea still. That is all unclear. There are also local newspaper articles, such as Panama America, in which it was written that Eileen called Guide F on Wednesday, actually, April 2nd, to make the tour booking. So that must have been really early then for that same day. And he himself told a Dutch newspaper in 2019, "I have never seen the girls." So that's just one example of how unclear it is what actually happened in detail. Then Cried and Attention highlight that according to F's police statements, Miriam Guerra, so the host mother of Kris and Lisanne, was a friend of him, and that he knew exactly where Kris and Lisanne were staying, and that it was a symbiotic business arrangement for all involved. Travelers would come to Boquete, study at the language school, sightsee with Guide F, and stay at his friend's house down the street. So there's been some discussion sometimes, like how was it possible that Guide F, when they didn't show up in the morning on Wednesday, knew exactly where to look for them? So either Eileen knew that from just the information in the computer or that she was given by Ingrid, or Guide F himself knew because he knew Miriam. That may also explain why he so easily got the key to their room. About entering this bedroom of Kris and Lisanne, Guide F told police, "To our surprise, we found some things on the bed, a backpack and some sandals falling onto the floor." He called Miriam again to let her know that the girls were not in their room, and says she was very surprised. She had been waiting until 11 at night to have dinner with them, so the earlier evening, and after some time she decided to go to sleep because she had to get up early the next day for work. She had left breakfast for them the next morning and thought if they come home late, they will also wake up late. So Miriam never really checked herself in their room in the morning to see if they got back safe or not. She assumed that they were still asleep, but she was surprised to hear from Guide F that the room was empty. What I never really hear people about or read about is why didn't Miriam or Guide F or Eileen simply call Kris and Lisanne on their mobile phones at that point? Look if they pick up or what's going on. So that's on the Wednesday. Maybe they did, but we have no information about that. And the phone logs have been, I think, unearthed. They have been covered by Imperfect Plan, for instance. There's no information about anyone calling the phones of Kris and Lisanne to check where they were. So everyone's calling each other, but there's no evidence that the girls were called themselves. Also interesting in the police files is Guide F, he blames Eileen for not going to the police right away on the Wednesday. Because there's in some versions of events, he and Eileen, after going to the bedroom, went to his farm that afternoon. Never mind that Eileen was the only one working in Spanish by the River and must have left the desk unattended all day then. But in another version of events, in other interviews, Guide F said that no, they separated that day and they later met up again to see if Kris and Lisanne had showed up again, which they didn't. So, but here he blames Eileen for not going to the police straight away at that point. He said, she said maybe they are running into some problems or they were with friends at night and didn't come back for whatever reason. They most likely come back during the day. I told her we should tell the police. She told me if we were in Germany, we would have to wait 24 hours. I told her that in Panama it is basically the same system, so that's that. I find it odd, but what will you do? Maybe they truly believed it was too early to go to the police. Police files, it stated that Eileen and Guide F did go together to his farm that afternoon. And they go to the police eventually in the evening. I don't know why Miriam didn't do that. I don't want to bash Miriam, but it's just a question, like, the girls stayed at her home. They didn't come back to her room, her house. I don't understand why she's a bystander in all this, but anyway. So then that's still not the end of the second podcast episode, because then Jeremy Clyde and Mariana Atencio also talked to several people, including José Donderis, who's the former national head of SINAPROC, the group who went looking for Kris and Lisanne in the jungle. He personally participated in the searches, and the case still haunts him, he tells them. The initial investigation of these young women was not in the hands of professionals. He calls the investigation a disaster. Too much precious time was wasted on scouring every tourist walking trail in the area instead of focusing on the Pianista Trail. But it took time, he explains, to interview the people living on the Pianista Trail, and in order to get a clear image of things. I mean, they didn't leave a note behind, Kris and Lisanne, where they were going, so that's understandable. And he says there was rain, even some storm during the first weeks of searching. They very quickly worried when they didn't find anything. He believes they went off trail. But he also explains that SINAPROC never left the beaten paths. That's interesting. I mean, the information I read at the time is that they looked through the entire area above Boquete, and not just on the beaten path, but also outside of them. But apparently not, according to José Donderos. They just stayed on the beaten paths. There's enough water there, he says. There's enough, and there are many sheds. Find shelter in. Still pains him that they didn't find him, and that the search was already suspended within 2 weeks, and he felt like leaving them behind. So yeah, that's interesting. Why 2 weeks without finding anything? Because at the time they didn't find anything. All the remains, which were just a couple of remains basically, were found months later. Clyde and Atencio, they also interview another person called Martin Ferrara O'Donnell, and he will play a role also in later episodes of this podcast. So Martin O'Donnell, he is a local, and he worked on this disappearance case himself as a private detective of sorts. He was partly funded also by expats in Boquete, but he gathered quite a big case file himself over time. I don't think everyone out there takes his claims for truth, but they are interesting nonetheless. So Martin O'Donnell, he also shed some doubt about some of the details in the statements of the couple who found the backpack of Kris and Lisanne, Irma and Luis. They are from Alto Romero, where the bag and the remains were found close by, relatively close by. And there are already different stories circulating about where exactly this backpack was discovered, depending on which media you read or hear about. And it was either found in a rice paddy or stuck in the middle of the river or underneath some rocks. And Irma said that she was alone at the river when she found the backpack and went home to show it to her husband, Luis. This is what Martin O'Donnell tells in the podcast. But Luis, we find out, has testified to police that he was right there at the river when Miranda saw the bag and took it along. Yeah, this is a bit confusing because the stories, they don't add up, they don't line up in that respect. Irma and Luis also both declared to police that it was the very first time that they went to this rice paddy, which was quite a bit away from Alto Romero, quite a walk, and it also says so in the police files, but I don't know how this makes sense. And O'Donnell also wonders about this because if they'd never gone there before, who would normally work on that rice paddy then? And why walk at least 2 hours to go to this specific spot to wash your clothes, apparently, or work on the rice paddy? And then what are the odds of ending up exactly there at that spot where the backpack of Kris and Lisanne was supposedly lodged in the river? So, I mean, it's possible, but he places some question marks there. And he also mentions the phone call that was made to Bouquet police the next morning, informing them about the discovery of the backpack. So this was in June, quite a long time after the girls disappeared. But this call didn't come from Louise and neither from Irma. The guy who called was called Domingo Gonzalez, and he is the brother of the tour guide, actually. Domingo, the cattle ranger. It's quite interesting because this was always covered up. No, this is the wrong word. It's not covered up, but it was never highlighted in the media. This was really the first time I heard about that. It's an interesting link, but somehow it never ended up explicitly in the countless articles and research papers that were sent out in the world since the disappearance. It doesn't have to mean anything, but it is interesting, of course, thinking about possible links in all of this. I mean, it's a connection, and O'Donnell also implies now that the possibility at least creeps up that Domingo could theoretically have been involved in telling his employees where to look for this bag. Perhaps, maybe it's just a coincidence that they found it, a good one. Maybe he was involved in explaining to them what to say or what to do. I think many of you have watched the Travel Channel, who also did an episode about this case. And they went to Alto Romero, and they were actually, from what we could see in the show, they were not met with a lot of enthusiasm. There was more like a suspicious vibe going around. And the villagers first had to have a private meeting before being able, at least Louise and Irma, before they were allowed to talk to the American team. And they gave some strange statements also about where photo 508 was taken, but that's another topic. But you can see that in that small hamlet that there are some people with more power than others. And anyway, it's interesting. So O'Donnell, he goes all the way to the other side and believes that the couple planted the backpack and that the whole Gonzalez family is involved in the whole setup, but that is not proven. So it's just... But it's an interesting question, at least, the connection. Crichton and Attention, they also interview a long-term neighbor from Guide F, living in Alto Romero as well. They call him Guide Tony. And Guide Tony says that Guide F is a wealthy landowner by Panamanian standards, who had his farm for a long time already, and that the family as a whole has a lot of influence and power there, especially over the Ngabe Bugler residents, because they are employed partly by him and his family, and the brother then, of course, also. And Tony is quoted saying, "The local indigenous people feel scared when they are threatened, and even more so because they work inside the community for him. He didn't have any authority. He lorded over them until now, after what happened to the Dutch women." Tony believes that Gadef desperately wants to keep this case quiet, that he tells everyone in Alto Romero not to talk about the case anymore. He talks to others about this case, saying it was an accident. If he has nothing to fear, why is he threatening others not to talk? That is a little bit what Martina is also saying. We don't know, as listeners, if this is just gossip or if this is just the talk of the town and they try to, give him a bad rap, or if it's true. The fact that there are more people saying this or declaring this, and there will be more in the podcast actually, is something to note. I think it's interesting, but without actually living there or knowing firsthand, it's hard to be sure if it is hearsay, if it's true or not. What is also interesting, there's always a lot of talk about the state of the backpack, how it was found. Was it wet? Was it dry? Was it too dry? Was it a bit wet? I haven't seen the backpack myself, but based on the photos, it didn't look too wet to me. The fact that the phones and the camera eventually were in working order, I think it also implies that this bag was not submerged with water for weeks. So this Tony, he says that he was present when police came to Alto Romero by helicopter and when they opened the backpack. And he says that he saw it and that despite being wet, the backpack was in pretty decent shape. Having extensively been exposed to the jungle for 10 weeks, it held up. It was damaged but intact. I saw when they took out the cell phones and money, all those things, they were full of water. They took them out of the plastic bags and they were full of water. I'm not too familiar with camera systems, but I think they were functioning because the photos inside the camera came to light afterwards. So, yeah, I mean, things were wet, but how wet were they? How long did the bag... I mean, what it comes down to is, of course, the question, was that bag in that river for all those weeks and months? Or was it placed there recently? And was the couple told where to go and look for it and pick it up? We don't know. So he mentions plastic Ziploc bags. I didn't know about that. Did Kris and Lisanne bring those themselves to put the phones in? That's quite interesting considering they were not very well prepared for this hike. I mean, dressed in lightweight summer wear. They didn't bring a lot of supplies, no compass, nothing really. And so did they think about bringing those plastic bags? It was not the red bag that you get with your grocery shoppings everywhere. It were different bags, so plastic carrier bags. I don't know, but it's an interesting detail. And then the last detail from this episode 2. The podcast makers talked to a local backpacker called George. And he believes that the backpack is a huge red flag. Too convenient how it was found. It stayed not representing its supposed long stay out in the elements. It should have completely disintegrated. Quotes, our rainy season, we get 24 to 30 inches a month. So 60 days being out in the rains, heavy rains. I think that was an interesting find. It was too good to be true and way too late. So too late to save Kris and Lisanne, obviously. Or too late, it was found too late. So yeah, you can debate about this for years, and it has been debated for years. Is it normal the way the bag was found? Was it planted there? Was it not planted there? You can think of arguments in favor or against that. I do not believe that bag had been out there for 10 weeks. Considering the minimal amount of plants and dirt that was found in it. But you cannot prove it, so it's up for debate. Alright, going to episode 3. So in episode 3, Crichton and Tensho, they hike towards the monkey bridges. And we get some new details, some facts from them. It took them 3 miles and approximately 3 walking hours from the location of photo 508 to make it to the, I think it was the second monkey bridge. So in that sense, Crichton and Tensho, they disagree, it seems, with the presenters from Lost in the Wild from the Travel Channel, who stated that Kris and Lisanne could not have ended up at a river crossing by the time the first 2 emergency calls were made. But Crichton and Tensho, they disagree with this, I think, and state that they themselves reached the spot in 3 walking hours. So if we calculate that, it means that if Kris and Lisanne left the location of photo 508 at 2 in the afternoon, that they would have arrived at the river crossing by 5 p.m. And okay, that is still 20 minutes later than when the first emergency call was made, but it would be pretty relatively close in time anyway. So it is technically, if this information is correct, it is technically possible that after taking photo 508, they kept walking. They never thought, oh, we have to return. They never took any more photos. They just barged forward, in theory. And by the time they started calling the emergency number, they could have been in the region of the cable bridges. Whether or not that's a logical thing, I don't think so, but technically it could be possible. So they haul up at one of the monkey bridges, the podcast makers, and I think that they're trying to look whether or not some of the night photos could have been taken there. And they kind of believe that it cannot have been so, because, for instance, night photo 550, I'll add the photo in the background. The lines that you can very vaguely see, or which people believe they can see, from this cable bridge, supposedly, it cannot actually have been a cable bridge. There is a court-certified photo analyst called Eric Johnson, who's interviewed for this podcast. He also takes a look at this photo 550 to see if it could have been taken near that monkey bridge and if the lines could have been visible there in the background. But he does not believe that to be the case. And he says there's something called noise, and that introduces artifacts in an image, especially if you try to process an image or lighten it up using a photo editing program, so you can see more details. And unfortunately, the Panamanian authorities, in particular Bandida Pity, they did lighten the night photos. And that is also what you can see, according to Johnson. The lightened noise. He says it's garbage. I would not speculate that there's anything in that darker area. The flash on that particular camera is only good for 11 feet maximum. And that's under good conditions. I don't see a monkey bridge there. And when asked if he sees what could have been mistaken for a monkey bridge, Johnson answers, honestly, I do not. And I sat and stared at this picture for quite a while. Sometimes it's kind of like people looking at the clouds, trying to see what you hope to see. So yeah, this kind of takes the ground further away under the whole theory that the night photos show Kris and Lisanne at the location near one of the monkey bridges. The photos do not indicate that. It's not really possible to see where they are taken. So yeah, the flash on this particular Canon camera was good for about 11 feet, which is about 3.3 meters, which is not that far. And yeah, if you look at the Culebra River, it's quite wide. It's actually too wide for the photo to pick up on the opposite riverbank when you use the flash. And when you're standing on one riverbank, the other side, you wouldn't be able to capture it. So that also kind of indicates that these night photos do not show the Culebra River. They also confirm, the podcast makers, that if you try to focus this Canon camera in the dark, a little green light comes on. If you press the shutter just short enough, the flashlight will come on before the picture is actually taken. So that way you can use the camera as a torch. Because they had mobile phones, but these phones, they had very little battery life left. Whereas the Canon camera, the digital camera, it had much more battery life also when it was found. So that could have been a reason. I mean, it's of course one of the big mysteries, these night photos. I mean, what do they depict? Where were they taken? Why were they taken? And yeah, it's a good theory, I think, that all these photos were taken actually not on purpose, but because they wanted to use the light that camera emits when you just press the button long enough. So that would explain possibly the whole flurry of mostly random looking night photos. But it's just a theory. I mean, there are many theories, of course. So again, it is confirmed here what we already knew, unfortunately, that the case prosecutor, Bandida Pity, and her team, I would say idiotically, altered the images on the original SD card of this digital camera. I mean, you can hardly believe it, that they wouldn't have made a copy of the original and started messing with the copy instead of the original SD card, brightening photos and whatnot. I mean, the fact that they did makes you wonder what else did they mess with. I cannot get my head around it, and I don't understand why not more people making a big fuss about that detail, because what sort of prosecutor... And this was done before the camera and the SD card were sent to the Dutch NFV Institute, who, I mean, she credited them with the task of investigating the camera and the phones. You do not mess with the original card and photos unless, you know, you get a clearance for it, and unless they're a copy actually of the original. That's just my opinion. But anyway, so the podcast makers also confirmed that a handful of people, locals, cross these bridges every day. I mean, when they were there, they saw people crossing these bridges actually. And also that rescue workers searched these trails, including the bridges. So yeah, it's a strong theory from people that believe in an accident, that Kris and Lisanne were hauled up somewhere near these bridges, or one of these monkey bridges, and were somehow never discovered by the search teams. But it's a difficult one to defend, because we know that Sinaproc looked there for them. They didn't find them. And we know from multiple people who went there that this trail behind the Mirador and these monkey bridges, they are passed by locals, by tourists, every day in fact. And to think that they could have been holed up there for weeks and no one had seen them, and I think it's pretty much impossible. If they were holed up somewhere, it couldn't have been at these bridges. And now the podcast makers confirm that the night photos also do not show evidence of that. So that's that. Yeah, then we have episode 4. And I think I'm gonna make 2 videos actually. One for episodes 1 to 4, and then another for episodes 5, 6, and 7, because there's a bit of a divide in the series. The first 4 are about more technical things, and then the last 3 are really diving into a foul play theory. So there you have it. So we go to episode 4 now. So the podcast makers, they talk with José Donderas again, the former head of Sinaproc. He still thinks that Kris and Lisanne got lost and followed the river, believing it would bring them back to civilization, when in fact it goes deeper into the jungle. But he does say that he finds it peculiar in which condition the few bodily remains of Kris and Lisanne were found. He says he's seen it all, but nothing like this. In my 30 years of experience, 30 plus years in fact, we found bodies that are naked with marks from animals, but we've never seen bodies dismembered. I'm sure there are many cases where bodies fall apart and are dismembered in a way. But yeah, the podcast makers also go back to the coroner who personally did the autopsies of the remains, and Kris had already talked with this coroner who stays anonymous back in 2016 and 17. This coroner still believes that Kris and Lisanne were murdered, but nothing new is actually said there. At the time he also stated that just not enough remains were found to determine a cause of death for either Kris or Lisanne, and that is still the case. He does not agree with the state theory because there's such a low percentage of skeletal remains found that you cannot really say that it was an accident. But then on the other hand, it makes it also impossible to say with any certainty that they met foul play, because there's just no evidence of that. There are only a few bones found, so the left leg bones of Lisanne, and from Kris a rib bone and a part of a pelvis. But the only thing we know is basically that, and from Lisanne also part of her foot actually, that came loose of the shin bone. And a ball of skin, which is a controversial one because, well, I write about that a lot on my blog, but it's another side topic. Some people believe that Saida Pitti, who later said it's cow skin, and people like me, I don't believe that at all. I think the fact that the coroner identified it as skin from the shin of Lisanne, no coroner confuses cow skin with human skin, so I think that's just damage control by a very bad public prosecutor. But anyway, yeah, there's just not that much to say about the bones, nothing new, I think. And another person who they talk with is Dr. Georgina Pacheco, I hope I say that correctly, forensic anthropologist, archaeologist. She was also interviewed back in time by the Daily Beast, and she also agrees there's just not enough information available. You don't have the whole body, you don't have the whole context of what happened. It could be a homicide, but we don't know. It could be accidental, we don't know either. So that's that. Just like there's debate and people just don't agree on to which extent Kris's bone was bleached. Was it just whitening from normal sun exposure? Was it achieved by a chemical bath of sorts. The local soil where it was found, I mean, we already heard there's not enough natural minerals there to achieve this. And also, these bones were found in roughly the same place. So why would the bones of one girl show this bleached, between brackets, effect and the other ones not? I mean, it's a cloud forest. This is not a desert, but there's no new information about that, basically, presented in the podcast. And then they also, last part of this episode, before they go to another local guide called Mariana Bejarano. Again, butchering the name probably, but there's some trouble. He agreed to talk, and then when they arrive, he's quite drunk, and the podcast makers suspect that he purposely got drunk so that he could not say much. Maybe he was threatened as well. We don't know. He does say that they had orders to only search the river Rio Culebra, and not anywhere else. I don't know if that's true, especially, when he may be drunk when he says that. So, yes, that's that. So, to me, the first 4 episodes were interesting, but it were actually the last 3 that were really interesting. So if you're still listening by now, and if you are interested in the summaries of the foul play theory, basically, then I'll put a link down for part 2. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone's well.